All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. Welcome to today's webinar, Mitigating Harm Through Community-Based Ideas, with Audrey Wennink, Grace Chan McKibben, and Emma Jasinski. And you can share your thoughts on hashtag #OnTheParkBench at tinyurl.com/OTPBfeedback. And join us for upcoming webinars. On Tuesday, June 25th, join us for Authors Forum, Killed by a Traffic Engineer. Join author Wes Marshall as he reveals the profession's shaky, unscientific foundations and points the way to safer, healthier streets. The webinar will be moderated by Rob Studeville. You can register online at cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench. And join or renew your CNU membership. Be sure to get connected to a powerful movement to advance walkable urbanism and get the resources and tools to affect change, as well as sharpen your skills in the architecture of community. Navigate to cnu.org and select our member portal. And for today's webinar. Our speakers today include Audrey Wennink, is a senior director with the Metropolitan Planning Council. She has worked on transportation planning and policy for 20 years. Her current work is focused on advancing sustainable and equitable transportation, improving transportation safety, and boosting mobility for those of all ages and abilities. Under her leadership, MPC developed reports including Reconnecting Communities and Toward Universal Mobility. She is a member of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning's Transportation Committee and on the advisory boards of WTS and Young Professionals in Transportation. Grace Chan McKibben is Executive Director of Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. For nearly 30 years, she has held senior leadership roles with many organizations in higher education, government, financial services, consulting, social services, and policy advocacy. In these roles, she led numerous programs that brought communities together and amplified voices and influence of marginalized communities. Most recently, she spearheaded the advocacy to create the first Asian American majority ward in the city of Chicago. She serves as secretary on the City of Chicago's Community Development Commission, chair of the Mayor's Office's Asian American Pacific Islander Community Engagement Council, and is a member of the Illinois State Asian American Employment Plan Advisory Council. She is also a board member of the Illinois affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union and an advisory board member of Midwest Asian Health Coalition. Emma Jasinski is the senior community designer at Design Trust Chicago, an emerging multidisciplinary civic impact design studio started in 2020. As a creative practitioner and a passionate cultivator of community, Emma has 12 years of experience in the design industry and nonprofit sector. She has filled roles such as architectural designer, project manager, and design director. Her experience ranges from international sanitation infrastructure projects to national multi-family affordable housing programs and healthcare clinics to focusing on domestic violence shelters. She's a member of the Association of Community Design. Today's webinar will be moderated by CNU President Mallory Batches. And as a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they occur to you. Let's start today's webinar. All right, folks, over to you.
All right, we'll get those slides into full screen format. My name is Audrey Wennink, and I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you to Lauren and Mallory and CNU for inviting us to chat today. And I'm also really pleased to be here with some great community partners, Grace Chan McKibben and Emma Jasinski. And we are really happy to tell you about some of the work we're doing here in Chicago. And I think we might need to change the format of the presentation. I'm seeing notes. Are others seeing notes? Yes. Okay, so let's change the presentation. So we just show full screen if possible. And if we need to leave it this way with the slides down the side, we can. Yeah, let's just leave it with the slides down the side then. Sorry, you'd think we'd be flawless with Zoom by now, but it's always an adventure. And so we'll get those slides up in just a second. But what we're here to talk about today is an effort that we undertook in anticipation of the Reconnecting Communities program. People may be aware of under the Federal Highway Administration that there have been many discretionary grant programs under the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the Reconnecting Communities program was for the first time funded projects to mitigate the harms of historic transportation infrastructure. And I know, Hugo, you're going to get the slides up there in just a second. And we'll show you the cover of our report where MPC, as a nonprofit and advocacy organization, could see that this opportunity for reconnecting communities, thank you, was on the horizon. And we wanted to help our region get ready for that and make sure that we were prepared to have a really strong application in the Chicago region and hopefully get some resources to help mitigate the harms. You can see in the cover of this report, a huge highway going through communities in Chicago and a train down the middle. And what we did was do some analysis and community engagement that generated project recommendations. And then we were able to work with the city ultimately on a grant. And I'll get into a lot more details on that. And so if we move to the next slide, what the report did that was really important for the Chicago region is document for the first time in a comprehensive way the impacts that transportation infrastructure has on neighborhoods. And you can see in this photograph, this is a picture of the Chinatown community in in the South Loop area of Chicago. You can see on the left side what it looked like in 1938. And there already was freight rail infrastructure. That's that big vertical swath in the middle. But then, present day, you can see two huge highways, I-55 and I-90. Were built right through Chinatown, and that had massive impacts to the Chinatown community, lost a lot of public space, and there are a lot of negative impacts from all of those, all that concrete. So if we move to the next slide, we're going through this reckoning at the national level where we're realizing that it doesn't have to be that way. We've lived with this infrastructure and we've grown up by highways. Those of us most of us alive today have grown up with those highways that were already built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and are used to and have normalized their existence. However, they have tremendous impacts on a community life. For example, transit riders waiting in the median of that highway, which you saw the picture before, and the incredible noise that is generated by cars. It's really stark in Chicago when you're on those platforms waiting for transit and you can barely speak to someone next to you, the amount of noise that's generated. The statistics show that sound levels regularly exceed 70 decibels, a level deemed harmful to human hearing. Generated by that traffic impact. If we look at air quality, you could see in this map in the center the prevalence of asthma in the city of Chicago, and you can see in red lines where the highways are located. And And you can see that there's a lot of intersections between where there's asthma and where highways are located. There are many areas in Chicago with small particulate matter, PM 2.5, in the 80th to 100th percentile of national values. Again, that's mostly near highways. And then if we look at household income, many healthy communities were severely damaged when highways were built in the Chicago area. And many neighborhoods have never recovered from these paths blazed through communities where there were a lot of homes removed, and there now are a lot of low-income residents, and those highways have really disconnected communities. And the irony of the scale of highways in Chicago is that a lot of the people that currently live near highways don't even own cars and don't use those highways. They just have the negative impacts. So let's talk about what we did with this report process. We socialized all this information about the harms of infrastructure, and then we said to communities, how could we make this better? What are locations that have issues that have negative impacts, and what are some solutions that you would like to see in your communities? And so we created a web-based tool, and we also went out into communities and did some public engagement. We did a virtual open house, and the pictures you see here are some of the different types of examples we gave to people of, underpass parks or complete streets or highway caps to get people's juices flowing in terms of ideas. And then we collected those ideas from the whole region, although most of the ideas did come from the city of Chicago. And our team members, Chris Johnson did a lot of GIS analysis. Hugo Garanado, who's here with us today, did a lot of the project analysis, and Debbie Liu did engagement work for this project. And so what did we get? We received 120 ideas for community projects that residents identified. We categorized these project types, and then we put them through a pre-screening process for those that would be suitable to apply for a Reconnecting Communities grant, looking at the notice of funding opportunity and the criteria that they used. And you can see the types of projects that people suggested, transit, a ton of bicycle, pedestrian, complete streets projects, some parks, underpass community space, redesign of highways and ramps, and improvements to viaducts. And we're going to get into a viaduct project conversation a little bit more today. And so one of the project ideas was working to mitigate the harms of the many viaducts that are in Chinatown. As I noted at the beginning, there already was actually rail infrastructure for many, many years, more than 100 years, that went through Chinatown. It's still there. It's a big overpass, and that creates a lot of viaducts. And it's very wide. It has multiple tracks, and it creates long, dark, drippy, wet viaducts that no one wants to walk through. It creates a long barrier because there's multiple ones blocking multiple streets, or creating these conditions for multiple streets. So there are eight viaduct locations on one side of the neighborhood. And so we went through a process of looking at these locations, and we'll talk in more detail about that in a second. We looked at the 8 viaducts. If we move to the next slide, and scored those projects through our engagement tool. You can see the different, the criteria from the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, that comes from the federal government. There were different categories, and then we developed criteria. And we looked at data sets, as much as possible, federal data sets that the federal government would find credible, and and scored projects in terms of which ones would be most competitive if we were to apply for federal grants. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that once we scored those, the wide range of projects that we received, the Chinatown viaducts scored very, very high. This is in Justice 40 area. We prioritized communities that were historically transportation disadvantaged. And we looked at the environmental justice tool that the federal government used. You can see the rail yard. The elevated rail yard is highlighted in red. You can see the scale of that barrier in Chinatown. And because reconnecting communities is about connecting people to destinations, we looked at desired destinations for residents, looking at zoning maps and how this barrier disconnected people from key destinations. We looked at transit maps, where do buses go, where is there any rail transit? And we looked at the Chicago Department of Transportation cycling map, looking at where dedicated bike lanes existed or were planned. And you can see some of the destinations here in this map. In terms of the results of the scoring, the engagement tool provided us with geographic points where issues were experienced by the community. And you can see that, this, when we gathered all the information for this whole report, we sometimes saw point projects at single points. We sometimes saw issues along corridors. So we defined projects as either linear or as point projects. And then we saw a pattern. We saw projects, as would be expected, that they were clustering along different corridors. These are different highways: Eisenhower, Dan Ryan, Skyway. These are different highways. There's a toll road. The Metro Electric is a transit corridor, like a commuter rail. And then there are a few sort of projects that were not on any of these corridors, but it definitely highlighted, how they aligned in many times with major highway infrastructure. And then once we finished the whole report, and again, you can see the bordered in orange here, that was the actual report that my organization developed with these projects. And then we worked with the city of Chicago to help them develop an application for the federal funds. And you can see on the right side, the Reconnecting Chicago's West Side Communities report, which was submitted actually twice. They did not get funded the first time. They happily did get funded the second time. And that's different than the Chinatown project we're going to get into some more detail on today, but just wanted to let folks know that this report that MPC did has generated a couple different outcomes, one of which is the city application. And there will be funding to help with planning for connectivity across this huge highway that has transit running down the median and has disconnected some of the lowest income communities in the Chicago region. And there is a large effort that will be underway to reconstruct this entire highway and hopefully mitigate a lot of the harms as part of that. And our MPO, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, is actually setting up a project management office to coordinate all the projects in it and to coordinate the city's West Side communities effort as part of that. So that was a win. Of course, the work lies ahead of us to figure out all those details. If we go to the next slide, one thing what we really want to talk about today when we hear from Grace and Emma is another takeaway that we had when we were doing this whole project is sometimes they're really big projects, like I just mentioned, the future reconstruction of the Eisenhower Highway and all the associated elements of that. But many of the projects that were recommended were complete streets, bike walk, viaducts in specific locations. And when we thought about how we could move those projects forward, and when we talked with the city of Chicago, we realized that it was really expected that the community develop the projects to a certain point before they could get any kind of resources. And um, the funding, the federal grants are really competitive, and so you have to kind of have a little bit of an evolved project with renderings, et cetera, to do an application. And a lot of these other ideas were just ideas. That work hadn't been done, and they needed to create a vision of this space. And so that's really what brought us to form this great team. And we were so grateful. You're going to hear from Emma in just a second, that she works for the Design Trust Chicago, which provides pro bono design services, and came to the party with Grace, and was able to help Grace's community-based organization. But we realized that this is a big hole and a big gap in trying to solve these problems. And we're happy to tell our story of how we've been working through this. So I'm gonna turn it over to Grace, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the details of the viaduct work in Chinatown.
Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey. So first, a little bit about the organization that I lead, the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. We are a community-based organization that works in Chinatown and surrounding areas, primarily with the Asian American community. As our name suggests, that we work primarily with the Chinese American community. The majority of my staff are fluent in Cantonese and Mandarin, and myself included. And we were founded in 1998 as an organization that amplifies the community voice through voter education and mobilization. So for the first decade or so, we worked on voter education, mobilization, census outreach, and so on. And we started with planning, community planning, really with the Chinatown Vision Plan that was completed with the Metropolitan Agency for planning with CMAP, with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning in 2015. So we started with the Chinatown Vision Plan, which provided a high-level vision for all the different aspects of the community, everything from transportation and circulation to education, small business development, and workforce development. But we're really not primarily community developers or planners, and my staff is really small. And in fact, in 2015, there was only one full-time staff with a bunch of volunteers. When I started as executive director in 2019, we still only had one full-time, and I was the first executive director, and there's really nobody on staff that had planning experience. But we've partnered with other organizations. We've partnered with CMAP again for parking management plan, as well as partnered with other organizations for a walkability report. So we've been active in improving the walkability and circulation in the neighborhood since 2015. So what Audrey described is exactly what community-based organizations often face, is that we have opinions and ideas from the community, and we know that there is an issue that needs to be addressed, but we don't really have the expertise or the experience to do the plan, to do the design for the pre-construction work. So we've always had the experience of engaging with the local community residents as well as community organizations. So that's where we come in, that in this process, we led the part with reaching out to the community. We bring residents to give ideas and opinions about how they want to improve the viaducts. The 8 viaducts are in various different conditions of disrepair. Some of them have lights that are broken and dark. A lot of them have falling tiles or uneven sidewalks, uneven sidewalks. But residents do rely on these viaducts to get to and from work or in their daily commute because it cuts up the community. So we have the experience of working with the communities, and together with Design Trust Chicago, we had engaged the community in several sessions. There was one large engagement session where residents came to give their ideas about how to improve the viaduct and what their opinions about the viaduct was. And then after some ideas were generated, they responded to design ideas. We ended up together with Design Trust Chicago picking just one viaduct, the 23rd Street viaduct, as a prototype to work on designs and the details, and solicited ideas from the residents. And then Design Trust Chicago presented the design ideas. And I'm going to turn over to Emma to talk through some of the ideas that were generated and the decisions that were made.
Thank you, Grace. So here you can see some engagement photos from some workshops earlier last year in the fall. So, really understanding how people are traveling through the viaducts. So, talking about urbanism and, what does that mean for the pedestrian, for people in buses, bicycles, vehicle traffic. So really understanding what it means to be, transporting or mobile through these viaduct spaces. If you go to the next slide. So we had the opportunity to kind of share different inspiration images with residents and community members to get their input on what they would like to see when it comes to the improvements and overall transformation of these spaces. So like Grace mentioned, we focused on one viaduct as kind of a case study, a test fit. We went ahead and used 23rd Street. So earlier, Audrey had kind of showed some images of a viaduct. So you saw kind of the peeled paint, a lot of puddling. These are the viaducts of railroad tracks that are over 100 years old. So, what does that mean when we're revisiting and talking about repair? So kind of thinking about these spaces and not only like prepping and priming them for, repairs, but also how are we starting to like amplify, enhance, and also kind of transform. So in these images, the community is not afraid of color. Culturally, I think that's something within the Chinese American community, an opportunity to talk about their culture and history and lineage. So really inviting those colors in, always wanting bright lights. That's something from just repairing the existing lights, making sure they're all working, to, something that's fun and even more of like a statement piece. So somebody wants to, rather than not traveling through the viaduct, being like, yeah, let's go. I want to travel through I'm going to go through the 23rd Street viaduct, incorporating wayfinding and different elements. You can move to the next slide. So here's that bright kind of catching rendering we ended up developing as a new vision for the 23rd Street viaduct. So as I mentioned, wayfinding, welcome to Chinatown, really seeing this as a gateway rather than, a passageway that people are avoiding. Early on, Audrey highlighted, all the various infrastructure that really as fractures and components that divide a community. We wanted to use this and see this as a connector, and that like viaduct as a bridge from one neighborhood to another, or, you know, a residential space to a more, you know, business quarter. And then, you know, incorporating some of those decorative festive lights into these spaces. So if you go to the next slide, we can kind of see our schematic site plan. So this reflects what we're kind of proposing to do within this viaduct. This viaduct specifically was also slightly shorter. So we thought, hey, as far as maybe this is a good option to just as far as a scope, start small and then work our way down to the larger, more expansive viaducts. So to the south, we went ahead and closed the viaduct to vehicle traffic. So incorporating, you know, tables, seating. These are components that, you know, we can do different outdoor activities. One of the things Chinatown lacks is outdoor space. This is something as a result of all that infrastructure, that public parks were taken away. So incorporating some of those components, also adding bike lanes on both the south and north side of the street, and then still having a one-way vehicle passage to the north. And then if you go to the final slide, this image just kind of shows if you were walking and heading towards the downtown of Chinatown, what you would see. So you can kind of see those bright, fun blockades closing off the south side to pedestrian and cyclists. And then to the north, you have a car, you know, still allowing vehicles to come out through the downtown Chinatown area. And again, really wanting to start in these spaces from repairing the existing infrastructure and then building from there. So, you know, the lighting to paint colors, whether, you know, the signage or wayfinding is lit up, or those are just using various bright colors. I think there's different ways to kind of scale up, but our team really wanting to have a powerful, bright image to showcase the possibilities of what the viaduct can be. Yep, and I can pass it over to Audrey.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emma and Grace. You know, this is just the last slide here. You know, there's still a lot more work to be done, but what we wanted to share is sort of the process from identifying the problems, identifying potential solutions, getting to a place where you're even positioned to apply for grant funding for construction, socializing this with elected officials. And we had there was a meeting, a lot of the pictures that Emma was showing, some of them were during a meeting where the alderwoman was present, and there was a whole discussion about viaducts and rendering. So getting these ideas socialized and building momentum. This packet of renderings has been submitted to the Chicago Department of Transportation. So we're you know, we're getting it socialized with them. And then in terms of working on a funding source, there is tax increment financing. TIF is used often in Chicago. There's also, you know, these federal grants we might be able to apply for. We have had conversations with the special events department in the city of Chicago. They fund art. It's very complex to build and maintain a project like this, we have realized, because you have multiple owners, you have freight railroads, you have passenger railroads, you have the Chicago Department of Transportation, you have the Department of Community Events, you have the alderperson. So just figuring all of that out is part of the process. But now we're positioned with a vision where there's buy-in from residents, there's visualization, there's pictures to show, and now the community is ready to apply for funding and hopefully get something built. But it's a journey, and it's definitely we're definitely appreciative of groups like Design Trust Chicago. We just dropped the link, and they're a very unique organization that's been started and provides pro bono assistance, and that's been a real key. There weren't resources to pay for this pre-design work, and so sort of the matchmaking of helping these resources find their way to small community-based organizations like Grace's have been a big part. It's been a big win just getting everyone together and getting this project, these visualizations developed, and then we're hopeful that we'll be able to find the financial resources to actually build a project as the next phase. And here's our contact information.
Thank you so much, ladies. I am Mallory Batches, and I'm going to be running the moderation for the rest of this webinar here. And just to remind folks that the Q&A function is down in the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and add your questions there. I have a few questions myself that I'd love to ask y'all. As we were getting to know each other before this webinar, I let this group know that I actually grew up in the Chicagoland area, and so I was excited about to hear more about this project because to hear more about this program, because it's something that I would argue probably anyone in any city across the country has their own localized sort of understanding of the separation that these different infrastructure elements have created. And I can visualize the different projects very clearly, the opportunities very clearly in Chicago. So this is important work for the city, for my hometown. But I wanted to start us off with a question. Most of the folks that will be tuning into this webinar are going to be coming with some participation in the New Urbanist movement, members, folks who are part of our audience, who keep up with our communications about the movement and about the work of CNU as an organization. And so I wanted to start us off by asking sort of a broad question of how the principles of new urbanism, our membership, the folks who might self-describe themselves as new urbanists, they work at the intersection of design and policy and people, which is a little bit about what this entire program really you've presented today. But I wondered if you could each talk a little bit about how the principles of walkability and sustainability and equity are sort of, how you incorporate those principles into your work from obviously 3 different vantage points, 3 different leadership roles in a program like this, and more broadly in the city of Chicago. I don't know. I'll let you choose who would like to sort of start us off.
Maybe I'll start off by saying, I think sometimes we actually, CBCAC just finished a strategic planning process last summer where we looked at where the areas of focus that we want to focus on for the next 3 to 5 years. And we landed with civic engagement and policy advocacy. Civic engagement is something that we've always done, policy advocacy a little bit more recently. But the middle bucket is community planning and development, and then also civic leadership development. So folks would be like, how does an organization that started out registering voters and getting people mobilized to vote end up in planning and development, right? I think it goes hand in hand, because if we want to improve the lives of people in the community. We want to also improve their physical environment and the lived environment to build a healthy and thriving community. You need to have jobs, you need to have housing, you need to have safety and transportation and circulation, and be able to walk around your neighborhood without being worried about sidewalks not being even, and without worried about cars and being in the way of pedestrians and cyclists. I think these all go together. We also have a program that works with the city of Chicago to plant more trees. I mean, so I think that it does inform how we think about community development.
Well, piggyback off that. So I think, you know, I shared the schematic site plan of kind of what we are going to move forward with. But I think when we're talking about new urbanism and like how we're moving through our cities, whether it's, you know, the walkability, how we're being housed, things like that, it's from a design perspective, who are the people occupying these spaces and who are at the center of that. So there's so many different ways of moving through it, but who's kind of the majority. And so understanding, you know, at our first meeting too, it's a lot of seniors who are walking through these spaces, and it's not about, the question is, how are we getting cars through here? How are we getting people through here? So I think too, it's really important when designing how we're kind of framing these questions, because there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of components, but understanding who's at the center of it and then developing from there. So that's kind of where we landed with our specific test fit of more cyclists, having this pedestrian repaired space and still allowing some vehicle, but that's not necessarily the priority in this passageway. And then too, we did kind of do different options of a more vehicle friendly or a more totally pedestrian. So from a design, it's like who's kind of the focus and what problem are we trying to solve, and then reframing the question to fit that.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are such great answers. I don't know if I have a ton to add, but I'll just say, you know, that my organization, the Metropolitan Planning Council, you know, we've been around for 90 years in this region, and we focus on sustainability and equity in the built environment. And you know, the history of transportation has been one of really excessive focus on speed and efficiency and engineering, and I think we've all realized that has caused so much damage, and we really need to think about the lived experience. And so what we try to do is really lift up communities' ideas and connect them to resources and help you know, help them move forward their ideas. And so that this is an example of one of those cases.
That's great. Well, it's sort of, that leads me into maybe the next question that I have here, which is, you know, obviously the community-based organizations are a central part of how you were able to gain understanding, you know, even thinking beyond the Chinatown project specifically to the broader sets of, you know, these initiatives in sum total that are in the Reconnecting Communities report. You know, the role of community-based organizations clearly was very important, but I wonder, maybe you could talk a little bit about how or why that's the case, both in the specific, Grace, but, you know, I think, you know, in the more general as well, and maybe what lessons you've learned from that, but also how do you support those organizational relationships? You each have, you know, whether it's your own board, your own staff, your own stakeholders that you're responding to, how do you maintain those relationships between the communities, the community organizations, and then the larger design and or planning entities?
Yeah, I can go. I mean, I can go first. I mean, I think community-based organizations, many of them have been around for a long time. You know, others are newer. They have often struggled with access to decision makers, access to resources. And so I think, you know, my organization is one that sort of sits at the intersection of, you know, we're an independent nonprofit. We're not a government agency, but we occupy a space where we, you know, can work with government, work with community-based organizations, work with business, and we try to be a connector, and also you know, elevate the voices of community-based organizations and help them navigate the very complex, and even to us, we're always learning very complex structures that exist in terms of like the infrastructure that an average person sees. You know, they don't know who owns it and who maintains it and who pays for it. All of that stuff is super complicated, and just all working together to try to help figure that out and move forward and make it better. But the community-based organizations are the ones that live with it every day, and they know what they need. And so we need to let them help us, you know, tell us what they need.
Yeah. Emma or
Yeah.
Grace, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll probably say something from the community-based organization's point of view. It's actually very interesting that this week, National Capacity, which is a national Asian American community development organization, has their annual convention in Chicago, and I'm running back and forth. And so there are all these different all these different organizations that serve primarily Asian American communities, but it could be organizations that primarily serve Black communities, Latinx communities, or any other communities that traditionally had not had access to decision making, as Audrey said. So we provide the cultural bridge, right? We understand the language and culture for the community, so we can bring Cantonese speaking grandmas to the discussions. It's not something that they typically understand. Some of the barriers that we face when we start having these types of conversations is there's sometimes residents would wonder why we're asking them for opinions, because they'd be like, why don't you ask somebody who's trained in engineering or trained in design or trained in urban planning? So I think that the role of the community-based organization is not only to act as intermediaries to elevate the voices of these people, but really to empower them, to let them understand that their voice and their opinions matter. And I think that is a very crucial role to play.
We have a bit of a nuts and bolts question. This is coming from William Mullane, and he says, what level of buy-in have you been able to achieve from Union Pacific? My background is as an urban designer, and I know that many times there are really great design ideas that the systems, you know, Audrey, as you have pointed out, that the systems aren't necessarily, especially infrastructure systems, aren't prioritizing those design outcomes. And so I'm wondering what, and maybe I might ask that a little more broadly to say, you know, that when you're talking about major cities with major infrastructure investments and the sort of systemic demands that those infrastructure systems are bearing, there is some sort of inherent conflict between the immediate needs of a community, any one community or neighborhood, and the broader needs of the city. And, you know, how does the buy-in of the agents of these systems play into that? How do you get that buy-in?
Yeah, you know, as always, it's complicated. I would say, you know, so a couple things. You know, we have had had initial conversation with Union Pacific, and we have gotten some information about their policies around viaducts. And so we shared that with Design Trust Chicago. So as they were developing the designs, they were mindful of designing something that would be feasible as much as possible. For example, can you adhere things to the walls of a viaduct when the Union Pacific owns the structure, right? And so the answer is actually not really. Or like, if you wanted to paint art, you probably want to have it something that you could, can be removed for maintenance and things like that. So there are those aspects of it that you need to take into consideration when you're doing design. There are also the aspects of railroads own a structure, but then the city of Chicago owns the roads. And then the city of Chicago also, if we are to move forward with this, would be responsible for maintaining the wall first before we could install art. And so there's like an order of operations. Then there's the maintenance question. If you were to install lighting, who would then be required to change the light bulbs when they burn out? Like, those are things we've talked about at some length. And so we need to have future conversations with the Union Pacific. In this specific case, there's also been a conversation going on about whether this asset might be sold to Amtrak. And so that's been in the background, and sort of waiting until that sorts out is another variable in terms of ownership and actually being able to move forward with greater speed and intention. So yeah, those are some. I don't know if there's anything else you'd add, Emma.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job, Audrey. Yeah, there's kind of a diagram that Audrey shared of the ownership. So I think too, from kind of a design perspective, oftentimes we're working or looking at site specific, or like a lot or a property, this parcel of land. So while these like infrastructure passageways, there's still places, especially if you're living in a neighborhood or you're part of that community, have these stories, you have these experiences going through and seeing these as places. But oftentimes for people outside or the traveler, they just see it as a passageway. So there is this kind of interesting conversation, or kind of how you're looking at this work of like, it's not just a corridor, it can be a place at times. And then that kind of adds in this complexity of all the different people and ownership that touches it, from Union Pacific, the private ownership, to the actual street, the city. So yes, it is kind of like the procedures of how this work is getting done. We did see an example of a viaduct improvement in Chicago in the back of the yards neighborhood, and we were able to talk to some city officials about how that project went, and it took a long time. And but I think the impact, it does become this piece of people are like, I'm walking down that street instead of, 2 blocks over, or like, wow, it's actually this like pretty simple but beautiful mural with bright LED intentional lighting. I think another component of this work is there is just like, and this is across all cities, just like a level of remediation that has to happen with all of this infrastructure in these sites. So in addition to kind of scoping out and understanding the pricing of it, of like, we want to do this and add this, it's also a baseline of just prepping and repairing the existing conditions. So that adds kind of a level of cost, or just to think about, and really providing a fully fledged out and successful like project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have a question here that Emma, it may start with you, but I think Grace and Audrey, you probably both have, from each of your perspectives, something to add to this. It's a question about the fact that cities and communities within those cities are facing a lot of challenges. And so, yes, past harm and separation from past infrastructure investments and the damage those may have caused, but there are crises around affordability. There are crises, the climate is a crisis that cities are having to contend with, the loneliness and isolation. You know, the Surgeon General is talking about the sort of ramifications of that on public health. And then you pointed out in the report the ways that the infrastructure itself is contributing to damage of public health. And so, you know, I think about it from a designer standpoint, which is why I said, and maybe I'd start with you, because from my vantage point, when I was a practicing urban designer, it often felt like those these competing challenges were almost, you know, existential in nature. You're trying to balance so many things at once. And so I'm sort of wondering, in what ways were those sorts of challenges helpful to the design process, to the community engagement process, to the planning process? In what ways did you have to sort of keep a clear focus on exactly what the outcome you were seeking from this particular program was? You know, acknowledging that there need to be other programs to address, you know, many of these competing challenges that communities may face.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that's something that in my work within community design, you're always kind of, and I'm sure in everyone's work, recentering, what's the focus? Hey, because you named many issues that cities are facing these days. And two, you know, a lot of these spaces, because there is a kind of a shelter component, like unhoused population, things like that. But I think like two things to that helps. I'm so grateful for my colleagues on this call, and this has been a really amazing team. And I think like having, if you're able to, that's not always, you know, sometimes we're just stretched for capacity, but like Grace is talking about, you know, able to like mobilize residents, and that's her specialty. You know, Audrey within the planning, reaching out to these different agencies, this report, you know, having a team that everyone kind of has their role and is able to kind of, I feel like that's been helpful in recentering or focusing is, you know, having a cross-disciplinary team. And then also to that is, you kind of mentioned, this is a universal issue. This isn't unique to Chinatown. This is in many neighborhoods in Chicago across the US. So I think there's also this like ability to kind of coalition build around improving viaducts, where at moments, hey, Grace might find some funding that it's like, you know what, we're pivoting and our focus is like affordable housing right now, you know, but like maybe in Humboldt Park or another neighborhood in Chicago, we've been talking and they've found some access and they can take our work and use this viaduct information in Humboldt Park. Yeah.
That's great. Anybody else have anything to add to that one?
That was an awesome answer. I mean, I think I would just add just the ability to communicate the benefits. You know, a lot of times this project has like many different bottom line benefits, right? It does contribute to sustainability. It's benefiting non-motorized transportation. It's creating places for gathering, to build community and improve public safety. And so like a lot of these, I think that's the sweet spot is, can you find, you know, relatively low cost things you can do in communities that you can do relatively quickly that actually deliver a lot of benefits. And that's a lot of, you know, that's what a lot of what's proposed here.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I'm mindful of everyone's time. I see we're right at the top of the hour. And so I want to thank Emma. I want to thank Grace. I want to thank Audrey for your wisdom sharing with CNU today. Folks know that they can find the recording of this webinar on our website, on the Park Bench tab on the website. And thank you all for joining us today. It was a great conversation. We appreciate all of you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.